What's up everyone? Today I'm going to show you how to remove every suspension part on your vehicle. The vehicle we'll be using today is my 2014 Subaru WRX. If you're working on this specific car, I'll also mention the socket sizes you'll need to take off the bolts or nuts as we go through. Since we're covering every suspension component, this is going to be a longer video, so feel free to use the chapters below to skip ahead to a certain part you want to remove. First up, we're removing the brakes. I have the upgraded Brembo STI brakes on this WRX, so instead of the floating calipers, they're the sliding calipers. So that means all I have to do is take out a cotter pin, remove the sliding pin, and then I can pull the brake pads out. If you have the floating calipers, then you would just skip this step and go directly to the next step, which would be removing the two bolts holding the caliper to the knuckle. Once you remove them, it should just slide off, and you can set it to the side. I hung mine up with a zip tie so it'd be out of the way, but I didn't have to remove the brake line. The front brakes are done and the back brakes are the same up to removing the rotor. Depending on how long this has been on your vehicle, it might take some muscle to remove it. The rear brakes also have parking brakes though, so we can remove the clip at the top with some channel lock pliers and then unwrap from around the knuckle. They will still be attached to the parking brake wire, so pull the spring and you can pop it right out. You then want to pull the parking brake wire out of the back of the knuckle because eventually we'll be removing the knuckle as well. Next up are the Endlinks. These are aftermarket, but I did replace the factory ones and I tried like hell to get them off without a grinder, but those were the longest 30 seconds of my life, so then I got the grinder and cut them off since I knew I was replacing them with aftermarket ones. If you are taking off the OEM ones, I would highly recommend to replace them with aftermarket ones so you can easily remove them in the future. If you do, I have the Cartboy solid Endlinks and they feel great. Let's get the front control arm next. There are 3 mounting points. One to the subframe. This has a through bolt, so you'll need 2 sockets or wrenches, one for the nut, one for the bolt. One to the body. This just has a nut, but the bracket also needs removed, so that's 2 bolts. One to the knuckle. This is a castle nut and cotter pin through it. I was able to pull this one out, but on the other side it was so rusted, I just impacted right over it and sheared it off. Don't worry, this bushing is getting replaced. If you're not replacing it, you might still have to do this, but then just drill out the cotter pin. To get the bushing out of the control press, I didn't have the correct tool at first, so I wasted an evening in the garage trying to get this tool to work, but then I went to the parts store the next day and picked up this tool and made easy work of it. If you plan on replacing the bushing or removing the bushing from the knuckle, you'll also need to remove this bolt. Be careful because I snapped this bolt and then even when I tried to extract it, I couldn't do that, so I had to buy a whole new knuckle. If you successfully get the bolt out though, you want to put the lower control arm on loosely and hammer against the lower control arm to get the bushing out of the knuckle. I removed the knuckle from the car and then tried to get out the bushing, which made it way harder. Next we're going to remove the TieRod ends which connect the steering rack to the knuckle. This is another castle nut and cotter pin. Again, with the salt on the roads where I live, the cotter pin is rusted away, so we just sheared through the cotter pin, taking off the nut. Same tool we used for the lower control arm to knuckle ball joint, makes easy work of this as well. Moving on to the knuckle, we already moved the 2 ball joint connections from the TieRod end and the lower control arm. The next thing up is the axle nut, and it's the center of the hub. A tip here is to position a 2x4 or something to brace the wheel from spinning, hold the hub in place, and then you'll be able to easily get the nut off. Now we just need to remove the ABS sensor held on by a bolt. You might need to pry it loose with a flathead screwdriver after you remove the bolt. Next we can remove the 2 bolts holding the knuckle to the coilover and pull out the knuckle. Last thing to remove is the coilover. Since we already took the 2 bolts out to connect the knuckle to the coilover, we're halfway there. We need to remove the bolts that hold on the ABS sensor and the brake line. Finally, we can remove the 3 nuts from the top of the coilover holding it to the body and pull it out of the vehicle. Moving right along, we're going to take out the steering rack next. The protective metal undershield is the first thing to come out. There are several bolts holding it in, but the impact made easy work of this. Next we're going to remove the shaft that connects the steering wheel to the steering rack. Don't just loosen this bolt, pull it all the way out. I loosened it, and when I was trying to take out the steering rack, it was still caught on there, so that was fun to juggle. We need to detach the power steering lines as well. This is the most time-consuming part because of where they're located. I found the best way to do this, also recommended by Smedia, was to use a crow's foot to remove the nuts from the in and out lines. Now we can move on to the brackets that hold the steering rack in place. There are 2 of them, one held on by 4 bolts and one held on by a bolt and a nut. Moving to the rear of the car, we're going to start with the fender liners. There are a couple of bolts and several clips that need removed. I broke a couple clips and got some recommendations on what to replace them with, but if you have any additional recommendations, drop them in the comments. Similar to the front tie rod end that is connecting the knuckle by bushing, in the rear we have a toe arm. To remove this, we'll remove the cotter pin, remove the castle nut. If the cotter pin's rusted away, again, just going to shear through it. When removing the bolt that holds the toe arm to the subframe, there's also a washer on that lets you adjust the toe. This might be a pain for you to remove, but set it aside where you can find it so you remember to put it back on. Next is the rear trailing arm. This is a nut and bolt connected to the knuckle. We also need to unclip the parking brake cable. Then we'll need to remove a bolt that connects the subframe, and off comes the trailing arm. I removed the knuckle and upper rear control arm as one because with the axle in the way, I didn't have a tool that would fit to press out the ball joint. The axle nut is similar to the front. Hammer out the impression and ugga-dugga it off. We already removed the toe arm to knuckle and trailing arm to knuckle. We need to remove the lower control arm to knuckle, which is a nut and bolt. Since the upper control arm is still braced, it's easier to remove the pinch bolt that holds the upper control arm to knuckle. Now, there's a bracket holding the ABS cable, and removing two nuts lets us take that off. Now we're down to the two bolts and nuts holding the upper control arm to the subframe. Once these are removed, we can pull both the knuckle and the upper control arm out. Once we have it out of the car, this tool makes quick work of separating them. There we go. I don't have a great angle of removing the rear end link here, but same thing. I had to grind off the OEM one and then replace it with aftermarket. The coilover is connected by 2 points. One to the body, which we can remove with these two nuts, and the other to the lower control arm, which can be removed with a single bolt and nut. The end link will need unbolted from the sway bar to allow enough room to wiggle the coilover out. We are left with the lower control arm. We already unbolted it from the knuckle, so now we just need to unbolt it from the subframe and we can remove it. Let's not stop there. We want to remove the rear subframe, so we'll need to drop the exhaust. Depending on what you have, you might have to remove the muffler separate from the mid pipe, but since I have the muffler replaced with straight pipe, I only need to remove these two bolts, and then I'm able to wiggle it out of the grommets holding it in place. With the exhaust out, we can move on to the rear subframe, which allows us to unbolt the drive shaft from the rear diff. We need to hold the drive shaft in place with a crowbar or something similar, and then we can remove the 4 bolts and nuts. You should get something to support the drive shaft. I used a zip tie. There are 2 rear subframe brackets that need removed. They are held by 2 bolts on each side. Now that everything is removed, we're down to the last 4 bolts that hold the subframe to the body. You will want to support this somehow. If you just remove the 4 bolts, it's going to come down. You're just going to have to wiggle it out. I chose a rolling seat and a jack. Since I have the car on quick jacks, it made it easy to lower the subframe onto the stationary toolbox and then just raise and lower the car. If your car is on jack stands, I'd recommend just using the jack so you could lower it all the way to the ground and then pull it out. For our purpose, we wanted to remove all parts, so we have the additional step of taking off the wheel bearing and backing plate. If you are just removing the wheel bearing, leave the knuckle on the vehicle and it will make it much easier. There's a tool specifically for this. I didn't, so we're going to smash these out with the hammer and I'm going to replace them with 4 new OEM wheel bearings. If you're not replacing them and you have a hydraulic press, it'll make it a lot easier and you can reuse the wheel bearings depending on their condition. If you stayed to this part in the video, then you might also like upcoming videos such as me refinishing all these parts and upgrading and replacing some, so feel free to subscribe. But either way, on to the next video from me.